I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
The United States of America shares an array of values with the United Kingdom: freedom, democracy, respect. However, the UK has one major difference to its American cousin: the monarchy. Presidents have come and gone for hundreds of years, with each political party fighting it out for a place at the White House. And yet, the British monarchy has remained a constant. But what happens when one of the world's most powerful political leaders meets one of the world's most powerful families? This is When the Windsors Met the Bushes.
The British and American people are as close today as two peoples have ever been. We see you as our strong and trusted friend, and we believe that you in turn will find us as ready as ever to bear our full share in defending the values in which we both believe.
The British royal family has always been key to building and maintaining friendly relations between the United States and the United Kingdom. Unlike the U.S. president, the British sovereign always remains non-political.
You, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear.
I, Richard Milhouse Nixon, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office
that I will faithfully execute the office
of President of the United States.
Of President of the United States.
King George VI began the tradition of meeting U.S. presidents in 1939, only a few months before the start of World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt invited King George VI for a visit to the United States, and the event soon held much significance. Until then, no reigning British monarch had ever set foot on American soil, not even in colonial times. George VI's heir and daughter, the late Queen Elizabeth II, continued the tradition and met a record 13 U.S. presidents during her reign.
In memory of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who in death my people still mourn, and whom in life they loved and admired.
Some meetings went better than others over the years. In 1977, Jimmy Carter famously kissed the Queen Mother. More recently, Donald Trump broke royal protocol by walking in front of Her Majesty during an inspection of the Royal Guard. Queen Elizabeth II watched history unfold with every new U.S. president. The Queen's devotion to diplomacy has since passed on to King Charles III and senior members of the royal family, continuing to build strong ties with our friends across the Atlantic. In 2000, the American people elected George W. Bush as the 43rd President of the United States. Bush defeated the Democratic candidate Al Gore after a narrow and contested win, which involved a Supreme Court decision to stop a recount in Florida.
This is no longer an election. This is like Alice in Wonderland. I mean, we just get stranger and stranger, as Alice said.
I've been thinking this is just the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. How they could get it, how it could be given to one, taken back. Now, oh, we're not sure again. Just the back and forth, not sure. It's bizarre.
Gore eventually conceded defeat. However, the election still remains one of the most controversial in American history.
The crowds in Texas erupt. At 2:17 a.m., Mr. Gore calls Governor Bush, concedes defeat and promises, quote, to work with the president-elect on the handover of power.
So George W. Bush was the son of George Bush Sr. He was exposed to politics from a very young age. You know, he would end up going to Yale. He would eventually get involved in politics and become the governor of Texas. But there weren't necessarily high hopes for him. He wasn't an academic superstar. He wasn't the most articulate person. And there were higher hopes for his brother, Jeb Bush.
In his 20s, Bush flew warplanes in the Texas Air National Guard, graduated from Harvard Business School in 1975, and even worked in the oil industry. In 1978, Bush failed to successfully run for the House of Representatives, a clear, slow start for Bush Jr.'s political career.
I made the announcement that we would have no Governor Reagan's or President Ford's or George Bush's or John Connolly's come in this district to campaign on my behalf. And I did so because I wanted the people to concentrate on the candidate, to realize that we can represent this district in Washington, D.C., and we do not need the help of people outside of West Texas campaigning for us.
In 1977, Bush married Laura Welsh, a school teacher and librarian who would years later become the First Lady. Laura Bush gave birth to twin daughters in 1981, named Barbara and Jenna.
What Texans can dream, Texans can do.
Bush later co-owned the Texas Rangers baseball team, and he was finally elected as the governor of Texas in 1994 before running for presidency in 2000.
This victory tonight is a great honor. The vote carries with it an awesome responsibility. Texas is ready for a new generation of leadership, and I will provide.
George W. Bush's presidency started and ended with controversy.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
From his dubious 2000 election right up to the Great Recession in 2008, Bush faced many barriers during his political journey.
He had something that Clinton had. He had that ability to really appeal to the common man. He had something that his own father didn't have.
Bush portrayed himself as a compassionate conservative, more centrist, ordinary, and approachable than other Republicans.
He was lacking a lot of that political skill, the savviness about policies and encyclopedic knowledge about how things work. Though he lacked these things, so he lacked the ability to articulate himself, he appealed to the average American.
As a devoted Christian, Bush ordered the creation of the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives as one of his first bold domestic policies. His administration also scored early success with large tax reductions and major reform of the country's educational system with the No Child Left Behind Act. Bush was passionate about making sure every child had the best start in life and achieved record results in closing the gap between white children and ethnic minorities.
That cries jay. You know, the blue jay. Soon she who was alone said to her doll, "The shaman will go off alone to the top of the hill to listen for the words of the Great Spirit. Then we'll know what to do."
However, the real challenge of Bush's presidency came on 11th September 2001.
the plane exactly going into the building. I was standing right there on 100 Church Street. You gotta keep running. You gotta keep running.
Get out of the street. Go. Down the street.
The 9/11 terrorist attacks rocked the nation and sent shockwaves across the world. His father, George Bush Sr., declared that his son faced the greatest challenge of any president since Abraham Lincoln.
It's difficult to find the words to describe the feeling in New York City today. New York City is in shock. One of its most famous landmarks destroyed, thousands dead, and America is under siege.
So Bush Jr. had to deal with one of the most unprecedented attacks on U.S. soil. And this was at a time when we were just completely unprepared for this to happen. And he was able to really get the U.S. public behind him.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
President Bush stepped up to the crisis and provided the American people with clear leadership. He refused to hide away in a bunker and insisted on returning to the White House on the night of the attacks.
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens.
Bush's actions and powerful messages resulted in him becoming the most popular president in the history of polling, reaching a 90% approval rating in the immediate period after 9/11. The British government and royal family stood by America during the harrowing time. Tony Blair visited New York to vocalize his support to the American people.
ITN News. Can you tell us?
All I want to say here now is just our profound sympathy, obviously, of course, with the people of New York, and as we know, there are many British people missing as well. We were just talking, the governor and the mayor and myself, a moment or two ago, about the need to stand together at this time. If you just forgive me, I'll say this, that I can only imagine what it must have been like for people in New York over these past 9 days. But my father's generation knew what it was like. They went through the Blitz. They know what it's like to suffer this type of tragedy and attack. And there was one country and one people that stood by us at that time. And that country was America, and those people were the American people. And as you stood side by side with us then, we stand side by side with you now. Your loss we count as our loss. Your struggle we take as our struggle.
It means a great deal to the people of the city to see the support that we have in Great Britain, throughout the world, and we know we share this loss with so many of your citizens. And I believe that we are much closer together than we've ever been before, much more united, and much closer together. And I thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister.
I think, like all these things, there's a great need for cool heads. I mean, I remember so well when Lord Mountbatten was blown up in a boat that, like all these things, one always wants to rush around doing all sorts of things, but you have to, I think, sometimes think carefully. But I have nothing but the deepest sympathy, and we're all with the American people in this terrible tragedy.
The late Queen requested for a memorial service to take place at St. Paul's Cathedral the following day. In the months soon after, the royal family also attended a service at Westminster Abbey to pay their respects to the British victims who died during the terrible attack.
"800 friends and relatives of the 78 British victims were joined at the Abbey by the Queen, Tony Blair, and the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw. The former American President George Bush Sr. was there, and at the request of the bereaved, Dame Judi Dench read out the poem Remembrance.
Time is too short for those who wait, too swift for those who fear, too long for those who grieve, too short for those who rejoice. But for those who love, time is eternity."
The congregation also included New York firefighters and police officers, many of whom lost friends and colleagues in the World Trade Center attacks. Outside, a white rose was placed for each of the dead on the Abbey's memorial to innocent victims.
Emotions ran high, and the Windsors offered comfort to grieving families. Bush declared a war on terror, and Britain soon joined the U.S. in an air campaign against Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda.
Americans have many questions tonight. Americans are asking, who attacked our country? The evidence we have gathered all points to a collection of loosely affiliated terrorist organizations known as Al-Qaeda. This group and its leader, a person named Osama bin Laden, are linked to many other organizations in different countries, including the Egyptian Islamic Jihad and the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. There are thousands of these terrorists in more than 60 countries.
So he was able to get the US public behind invading Afghanistan. This was where Al-Qaeda was hiding. This is where they had a home. This is where possibly Osama bin Laden was living. And the idea behind the invasion was that the US would invade and they would eliminate Al-Qaeda and they would stabilize the region. But that's not what happened.
Our message to them is clear. No matter how long it takes, America will find you, and we will bring you to justice.
Bush became a wartime president and vowed to protect the nation and Western world from further terrorist attacks by any means necessary.
This, of course, is a moment of the utmost gravity for the world. None of the leaders involved in this action want war. None of our nations want it. We are a peaceful people. The murder of almost 7,000 innocent people in America was an attack on our freedom, our way of life, an attack on civilized values the world over. We waited so that those responsible could be yielded up by those shielding them. That offer was refused. We have now no choice. So we will act, and our determination in acting is total. We will not let up or rest until our objectives are met in full.
However, his controversial invasion of Iraq in 2003 caused much uproar. The U.S. and coalition forces invaded Iraq on March 19, 2003, due to concerns about dictator Saddam Hussein and the development of weapons of mass destruction. Over 4,000 Americans died in the war over the next 8 years. Public support and Bush's popularity massively dropped over the period of conflict.
What became much more complicated was when Bush and his administration decided to invade Iraq and stay there, and there was no exit strategy. They had no idea really what they were doing. I think they just assumed that they could be there in 6 weeks, hold elections, and that they would be viewed as liberators by the Iraqis, but that's not what happened.
No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. The last months of the Bush presidency were marked by a major crash of the stock market and a detrimental recession.
For the first time since the Great Depression of the 1930s, the US government will use taxpayers' money to buy shares in privately owned banks.
This action plan provides a coherent framework that will direct our individual and collective policy steps to provide liquidity to markets, strengthen financial institutions, protect savers, and enforce investor protections. Trust me, we're not wasting time. People are working around the clock to deal with this.
President Bush stressed the importance of international cooperation.
We will stand together in addressing this threat to our prosperity. We will do what it takes to resolve this crisis, and the world's economy will emerge stronger as a result.
The tax cuts of 2001 reduced government revenue, while spending increased due to the military conflicts. Bush's reputation crashed as his government racked up large deficits and the American people were left in financial despair.
There really weren't any terrorists in Iraq prior to this point, and then suddenly you see a mushrooming of these different groups that had a reason to believe that they needed to join some of these violent groups, and it was incredibly costly. The war on terror cost the U.S. $2 trillion. It was $2 trillion of taxpayer dollars, and there were a lot of missteps along the way that were never accounted for.
I know Americans are concerned about the adjustments that are taking place in our financial markets. The White House and throughout my administration, we're focused on them. And we're working to reduce disruptions and minimize the impact of these financial market developments on the broader economy.
A catastrophic end to a rocky presidency for Mr. George W. Bush. Britain and the United States maintain a special relationship rooted in common history and shared values.
And every tendency, however natural, which turns our minds or energies from the supreme objective of the general victory of the United Nations, by singleness of purpose, by steadfastness of conduct, by tenacity and endurance, such as we have so far displayed, by these, and only by these, can we discharge our duty to the future of the world and to the destiny of man.
War hero and Prime Minister Winston Churchill first coined the term special relationship in 1944 to describe the close cooperation between the US and UK during World War II. President Bush's administration also strived to protect the close ties between Britain and the US, celebrating both countries' similarities and differences. Blair and Bush enjoyed a personal chemistry and mutual understanding.
I'm here to argue for the position I've always argued for. And I've raised this issue of weapons of mass destruction for ages. So it's not a question of George Bush wanting to do this or anyone else wanting to do it. I believe it is necessary in the interests of this country. And it is only when we deal with these threats that we will usher in a greater sense of order and stability in the world, and incidentally also restore some order and stability to the economy of the world today, which is overshadowed, of course, by these threats.
The two countries formed a strong alliance during the War on Terror until the end of Blair's premiership, even when the military conflicts became unpopular with British and American voters. President Bush also maintained relations with the royal family and showed much respect towards the British monarchy. In times of turmoil and unease, Bush particularly lent on the then Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall, Camilla, when it came to showing a face of unity between the two great nations. President Bush and the First Lady invited Charles and Camilla to a White House dinner in 2005. The pair toasted to each country and shared outlooks on key global issues. Bush's positive relations with the British government and the Windsors greatly benefited his public appearance and his fulfillment of foreign policies. In 2003, the 43rd President of the United States crossed the pond and visited Buckingham Palace for a state visit with Queen Elizabeth II. The great House of Windsor hosted the Western world's most powerful political leader on home soil. The royal family entertained Bush for several nights on the first official state visit made by a U.S. president. No American leader had been hosted by the Windsors for such a length of time since President Woodrow Wilson. Wilson made the journey from the U.S. to Britain after the end of the First World War in 1918 and met with former Prime Minister David Lloyd George and King George V. President Bush started his 3.5-day state visit to Britain with an official reception at Buckingham Palace. The then Prince Charles greeted President Bush and the First Lady at Heathrow Airport and led them down a red carpet to their entourage. The Bush's arrival at Buckingham Palace was met with a display of pomp and pageantry, including a 41-gun salute and a performance of the American anthem at the Windsors' request.
This was a day of firsts. The first time the Queen had welcomed anyone in a plastic pavilion screwed to the front of her house. Mr. Bush drove the 100 yards there from his suite, and from behind the 5-inch thick doors of his limousine, he emerged to a royal welcome. He once introduced himself to the Queen as the black sheep of his family. A lot has changed in 12 years. Now he's the president of a country at war, the commander-in-chief inspecting the guard of his closest ally with jet-lagged eyes. Today, he is a disciplined, controlled man. Occasionally, it showed. On a day so well controlled that he heard not a murmur of protest.
The British splendor and traditions confirmed the special status of the Bushes' visit. However, Bush's visit to the UK sparked a lot of anger from the British public.
This is George Bush and the Queen, as you will not see them in London this week, riding in an open carriage, surrounded and protected by anti-war demonstrators.
Despite the noise, this was the friendly face of anti-Bush protests as I joined a crowd of several hundred, all determined to have a fun day out, as well as take their message to the heart of London.
At the time, the Iraq War was a polarizing and contentious subject in Britain and the US.
Negotiating an unexpected queue of traffic outside Buckingham Palace, this was the closest George Bush and his entourage have come so far to the protesters who object to his state visit to Britain. It happened in late afternoon as demonstrators in numbers began making for the palace. Police lines were drawn across the Mall. Anti-Bush activists were running towards the Queen Victoria Memorial. They hoped their cries would carry to the apartments where the Bushes are staying.
Bush, go home! Go home! We don't want you here!
Before dusk, there'd been 22 arrests, according to Scotland Yard, mainly for minor offences including theft and drunkenness, none under anti-terrorism laws.
With Tony Blair supporting Bush's government, protesters seized the state visit as an opportunity to demonstrate against the military invasion.
It was pointed out to me that the last noted American to visit London stayed in a glass box dangling over the Thames. A few might have been happy to provide similar arrangements for me. I thank Her Majesty the Queen for interceding. We're honored to be staying at her house. Americans traveling to England always observe more similarities to our country than differences. I've been here only a short time, but I've noticed that the tradition of free speech, exercised with enthusiasm, is alive and well here in London. We have that at home, too. They now have that right in Baghdad as well.
Bush limited contact time with the British public and mainly kept to events at Buckingham Palace and speeches to selected audiences. Mr. and Mrs. Bush also attended a state banquet at Buckingham Palace during the visit. A less political affair, the Queen hosted a dinner full of entertainment, pageantry, and luxury, with senior royals Prince Charles and Princess Anne also in attendance.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you and Mrs. Bush to London. Visits by American presidents have been memorable landmarks in my reign. Unlike in the United States, the British head of state is not limited to 2 terms of 4 years.
Your Majesty, Your Royal Highness, and distinguished guests, Laura and I are deeply honored to accept Your Majesty's gracious hospitality and to be welcomed into your home. Through the last century and into our own, Americans have appreciated the friendship of your people. And we are grateful for your personal commitment across 5 decades to the health and vitality of the alliance between our nations. Of course, things didn't start out too well. Yet even at America's founding, our nation shared a basic belief in human liberty. Let us raise our glasses to our common ideals, to our enduring friendships, to the preservation of our liberties, and to Her Majesty, the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
The late Queen and President Bush exchanged pleasantries, thanking each other for the enjoyable visit and reaffirming the two nations' historic alliance. In 2007, President Bush and the First Lady returned the favor and hosted Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, at the White House.
The American people are proud to welcome Your Majesty back to the United States, a nation you've come to know very well. After all, you've dined with 10 U.S. presidents. You helped our nation celebrate its bicentennial in 1976. She gave me a look that only a mother could give a child. You have helped commemorate both the 350th and 400th anniversaries of the Jamestown settlement. Your Majesty, the United States receives with honor the Sovereign of the United Kingdom. We welcome back to the White House a good person, a strong leader, for a great ally.
The President and Mrs. Bush entertained their royal guests with several ceremonies, including a white tie dinner. Around 7,000 guests were in attendance at the arrival ceremony, including British Embassy staff, members of Congress, and White House staff. A fine American welcome for an admirable leader and a respectable ally.
A state visit provides us with a brief opportunity to step back from our current preoccupations, to reflect on the very essence of our relationship. It gives us the chance to look back at how the stories of our two countries have been inextricably woven together. It is the moment to take stock of our present friendship, rightly taking pleasure from its strengths, while never taking these for granted. And it is the time to look forward, jointly renewing our commitment to a more prosperous, safer, and freer world.
Since Bush, the Windsors have been kind enough to continue the tradition of state visits for U.S. presidents. The occasions certainly strengthen ties between the two nations and reinforce the centuries-old bond. George W. Bush's presidency transformed American politics. The country's economy and place in the world was far different when the Bushes left the doors of the White House compared to when they entered. His legacy, therefore, remains a subject of debate. Bush faced an unprecedented event with 9/11, and one which changed the course of the United States forever. The foreign policies and military conflicts after the attack ignited political division amongst the American people. The effects of his actions in the Middle East can still be seen today.
The most important legacy of the Bush Jr. administration was the war in Iraq, and to some extent, the war in Afghanistan. This cost trillions of dollars. It was incredibly expensive, and you see today, Afghanistan is right where it started. You have a Middle East that has been shaped by the Bush, by the neocons, that is inherently unstable when there was so much promise for it to be at least slowly liberalizing at a pace that was more manageable. The Taliban is in charge. There really isn't a democracy. There's not really any respect for human rights there. Women's rights have suffered. So there were some gains that were made, but because they didn't do the planning, they didn't invest, they didn't study, they didn't involve people that knew how to speak the language, it failed.
Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Since leaving office, the Bushes have retired to Texas. Today, George W. Bush and his wife Laura lead outreach work through the Bush Institute and Presidential Library in Dallas.
So pleased, Mr. President, that when you are wandering these halls as you wrestle with tough decisions, you will now be able to gaze at this portrait and ask, what would George do?
The Bushes' mission to do good outside of the White House has earned the admiration of former presidents from all sides of the political debate. The Bush family still maintain a connection with the Windsors even now.
So our vets not only can make huge contributions, and I really appreciate what you're saying about employees, but our vets can set such an incredibly good example for people who are, should view themselves as fortunate to live in our country.
The then Prince Charles attended George H.W. Bush's funeral in 2018, where George W. Bush gave a touching speech in memory of his father.
He recognized that serving others enriched the giver's soul. To us, his was the brightest of 1,000 points of light. In victory, he shared credit. When he lost, he shouldered the blame. He accepted that failure is a part of living a full life, but taught us never to be defined by failure. He showed us how setbacks can strengthen.
When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, the Bushes returned the favor. In a public statement, Mr. and Mrs. Bush described Her Majesty as a woman of great intellect, charm, and wit. The former President and First Lady also reflected on their fond memories of visiting Buckingham Palace for tea and spending time with the Queen's beloved corgis. The mutual respect between the two great families clearly continues to grow and prosper with every year which passes. Bush's heartfelt response to the 9/11 tragedy saw his popularity ratings rise to record highs, something which cannot be overlooked.
On September 11th, great sorrow came to our country. And from that sorrow has come great resolve.
The Windsors and the late Queen in particular would have only admired Bush's loyalty to the American people. However, the collapse of the economy and fallout from military action not only affected the American people, but also the world as a whole.
This is a decisive moment for the world economy. The decisions that we make now will affect our world for a decade or more to come.
The Bushes' time in the White House and place in history will surely be reconsidered and discussed for many years to come.